Okay, welcome everybody, and very pleased to have you all here to listen to Panagiotis's seminar. Panagiotis and Andrew and I have had a number of days together. In fact, we had a very beautiful week in Greece some years ago, working in the evenings and being on the beach during the day, discussing viable systems in the sun, and all very. I'm very impressed at his depth of knowledge of the viable system model. So I'm really looking forward to this. And this is work that some of which we've all been involved with, but it's Panagiotis's seminar. So there you go. Off you go.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Angela, for inviting me, and very, very pleased to be here with you. Today, I'm going to be talking about the VSM's role into designing and managing what I call future fit organizations. And really, future fit is about, as we're going to see, sustainability. And there are many terms for that, many alternative terms for that thing, future fit, flourishing, sustainability. I'm going to explain some of those terms, but I'm not a big fan of definitions. I'm a big fan of systems and models. So I'm going to try to explain that thing a bit systemically. So basically, I have 4 parts for my presentation. I hope I'm going to go through all of them. I'm probably going to go up to the hour. In terms of questions, if you have like a clarification question, happy to stop and answer that. I think it would be better if I take questions at the end of my presentation, so we can go a bit deeper, because there might be a chance I will be covering your question as I go along. So I'll be taking questions, towards the end. So 4 parts in my presentation. First of all, some like what I call organizational context in the 21st century. So, but that's basically a very quick intro into sustainability, like a sustainability 101. Just to familiarize, ourselves with what's happening right now in the world. And then very quickly, I'm going to try to take that down to the organizational level, which is really what we're, looking at here. How is this bigger context affecting an individual organization? And what does this mean from a systems perspective, and therefore from a VSM perspective? And then really parts 3 and 4 is really the main focus of the presentation. How can VSM, help us, first of all, manage and then design a new organizations in combination with other tools. So let me start with the first part. And this is, like, as I said, like a sustainability 101. So the last few decades, we have seen like this, what we call hockey stick diagrams in the society, economy, and earth systems. And we see like, explosion in world population, explosion in greenhouse gases, water use, fertilizer use, primary energy, we're pushing the earth system and societies to their limits. And this is called the great acceleration. It's also, some of the geologists call this phase that we're going through the Anthropocene. That kind of reminds us like the geological phases of the Earth. And, these take normally like thousands and millions of years, and we've managed to have like an impact on the planet as a species, so much that, geologists call this phase that we're going through the Anthropocene. And of course, this exponential growth cannot be sustained, and there are limits, and we know there are limits. There's been some studies about the ecological footprint analysis, and they show that in the 1960s, if everybody was consuming based on the average citizen of the Earth, we need like half the Earth, and then we're already over capacity. By 2030, we're going to be needing like 2 planets to cover the needs of our societies. And there's different ways of portraying that. Some others have like this Earth overshoot day. So at what point in a year have we used up our budget, let's say, in terms of resources for a given year? So we're running in a big problem. And this is only about resources. But as I said before, this is like also driving like social problems, economic problems, and so on and so forth. So why are we in this situation? One of the reasons why I say it's the basically the economy, and what I mean about that is the mental model that has been the dominant way of thinking for the last at least 300 years, and it's like this continuously growing our economies is like the main focus, right? We have to grow. GDP is like this metric being used very widely about how to calculate how healthy an economy is. It's like growing, and part of the mental model is, of course, this kind of vast expanse that the economy is like in an earth that is like has no limits, like it's an endless resource. And it's funny how I can't stop thinking that maybe this is the same thing that we have now with respect to the solar system. Companies wanting to go to other planets. It's the same idea, but it started like in this, in the Americas and the Wild West, and it's like a huge expanse. There's no limits. We cannot expand endlessly, and basically it's a linear system. We take, make, waste, right? And that cannot be sustained. And in about the 1970s, there were like a series of studies like the limits to growth, showing that there are actually limits to growth. The Earth system cannot sustain us. And by the 1980s, we have the first official definition of sustainable development, and it was coined in this report, Our Common Future, that was mentioned in the World Commission on Environment and Development. And in 1987, they said that sustainable development is a development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And this is like the most well-known definition of sustainable development. And you can kind of see like two parts in this thing. There's like a kind of a intragenerational equity, so all the people now have to have like access to the same resources, but also an intergenerational equity. So we have to like think about the future generations. And it's very interesting to point out here that this is not something new. I mean, if you look at indigenous cultures, they've been always, especially in North America, thinking about 7 generations, right? Either you look at 7 generations in the past and 7 generations in the future. So some basic decisions that you're going to make at the tribe level or society level, what would be the impacts in the future? And that's like, but more or less, this definition has like some of the basic components. But in terms of models, how can we model sustainability? And maybe the most common right now is the so-called Sustainable Development Goals. So right now, the United Nations have in 2015 agreed that by 2030, we have to achieve these 17 goals, the Sustainable Development Goals. They break down into more specific 169 specific targets, under each one of these goals. It's a vast, and massive plan for humanity to survive. It's very, very common, both in, countries and businesses. It's one way of looking at it. Maybe the most common way and one of the oldest way of looking at this thing is a so-called triple bottom line, which we can consider as a better version of the previous model. Instead of just the economy, we can now like look at society and the environment and the interactions between these 3 components, right? And sometimes people say, okay, sustainability is where we balance all these 3. There's a balance. But this is not very systemic. It's not like we can actually, kind of like overlap these things as if it's, mixing sugar and coffee or something. So it is a more useful mental model, but if we're thinking about something more systemic, and if we think about these 3 as systems, then we really have to think about what is their hierarchical or recursive relationships between these 3. And I pose this to my students, and I say, which one of these 2 models is right? Is it like the environment and society and the economy, or the environment, economy, and society? And it's funny how, some of my students say it's the second one on the right, it's the economy because it's important, right? And it's funny how the last year has made my life easy as an educator to show some things like with the pandemic. And I say, oh, really? And what happens when you have a pandemic, right? When you don't have a society that is fully functional, how can the economy actually function? You can't even go to the supermarket. So that kind of puts some priorities there which are really logical priorities. You cannot really have an economy without a functioning society. It's just like a basic systemic logic. So there you have it. That's a much better model of sustainability in the sense of this is how we should be looking at these three systems or three components of sustainability. Again, this is a simplification. Things are much more complex than that, but it's a nice little and sometimes powerful model to put some priorities in what we have to do. So that's like, let's say, at the macro level. What about, though, the individual organizational level? How is that affecting organizations or companies? And basically, companies have been dealing with this issue of sustainability or doing the right thing in this way. You can argue, and this is a work from one of my colleagues and dear friend Bob Willard, that businesses usually make a decision based on one of three justifications. It's either the right thing to do, and usually sustainability has been like kind of positioned in that realm, right? We have to give back to the society, and we have to take care of our community because it's the right thing to do, or because there's some opportunities to be captured or some risks to be mitigated. So it's usually a combination of these three elements when businesses are making a decision. So the problem is that, and you can look at it as a carrot and the stick from that perspective. The problem is that there's a huge gap between doing the right thing and these two other things. So for example, maybe you have a so-called corporate social responsibility program as a corporation or as a company, and you give back to the community or whatever, and then you have a risk, a crisis like the pandemic or something else, and then that gets canceled because that's like a side thing to the business. The main thing is like mitigating our risks and capturing opportunities. So you can see that there's a gap, there's a disconnect between doing the right thing, in quotes, and capturing opportunities and mitigating risks. However, in the 21st century, my main argument, this has been made by a lot of people actually, is that the landscape nowadays is different. You cannot have this gap. Actually, this doing the right thing is very much connected with capturing opportunities and mitigating risks. So a seminal report by KPMG in 2012 was the so-called expect the unexpected. And they were talking about the global mega forces of change that are happening at the global level. Things like, climate change, of course, automation, urbanization, ecosystem decline, changes in people's values in relationship to those mega forces of change. And of course, pandemics, which it was a bit sooner, but we can actually include that in this kind of mega forces of change. And actually, there's been some studies that argue that even the pandemic can be linked to some of these issues like ecosystem decline and encroachment of ecosystems. So this kind of context on these mega forces of change create this environment for enterprises now. So if we look at an enterprise or a business, this can be felt as increases in volatility in prices, physical and weather changes because of climate change. Your supply chain may be disrupted. Your stakeholders and your consumers are expecting different products, different services. We can argue things like social things that are happening. Last year with the Black Lives Matter movement in the US, we saw companies reacting to that and immediately saying we care and we have done this and these are our policies about including diversity and inclusion and all of that. That was happening, you can argue, because stakeholders were expecting these companies to react. So these challenges then present two things. Either the companies can capture the emerging opportunities of this new reality, of these global mega forces of change, or they have to avoid the emerging risks in terms of market, regulatory, reputational, physical risks, and all of that. And this is really the new context for businesses, or the new business case to be made for why should a corporation or a business care about sustainability. If we put it in in a more systemic language now. If we continue the previous model that we saw of the environment, society, and economy, then the next recursion level, and maybe there are more, but you can identify an individual business inside the economy, society, and the environment. So now we have to think about, what does this actually mean? So basically, you can think about a business having, impacts on all the three nested systems that are the higher systems. And what I'm arguing, not only me, is that in the 21st century, we're starting to see some boomerangs. So businesses are starting to feel the boomerang impacts or the feedback of those actions to these three nests, either environmental, societal, or economic. And this is a simplification. Things are a bit more complex than that. You might have like socioeconomic impacts coming back to you. Maybe it's not actually you that are creating this problem, but somebody else. But there is a growing sense that, the impacts you have on this nest can come back. And this is my conclusion to this section about, why would companies care about sustainability? Why would they care about this traditionally looked as a nice add-on or a good or nice to have aspect of business? It's because it has created a new context that I'm arguing businesses cannot afford to ignore anymore. So the main idea is that companies, by fulfilling their purpose and doing all these right things, or actually being smart about the context, through enhanced reputation and innovation, start to capture new opportunities and mitigate new risks and opportunities that were simply not there before, or maybe they were in the previous century, but they weren't strong enough. And we're now navigating an environment and a context that is rapidly changing, and these mega forces of change are becoming even more important for individual businesses. So in a nutshell, this is, let's say, the argument of, why would businesses care, right? What is the business case and why would they care about sustainability? Coming now to, let me pause here. Any clarification questions or something or anything that, okay. So let's go to the main focus of today. How can VSM help? There are many ways that VSM, of course, can help in this challenge. And the challenge is, how can businesses integrate sustainability effectively? And one of the problems that organizations are faced with, and this is part of the work we've been working with Angela and John in the last 8 years or so, is how do you integrate sustainability inside an organization? And for example, just to give you an example of a problem, is that if an organization chooses to become sustainable, whatever that means, it is faced with a multitude of approaches, multitude of tools, multitude of methodologies, certifications. So how would they know what are the differences? And how can we integrate all these tools effectively inside an organization's structure and management? So we took on that challenge and we said, okay, we're going to use the viable system model as the organizational template on which we can actually understand the differences between all these different tools and try to see how we can effectively integrate them inside the organization so that we can help the organization really improve towards sustainability. And in order to do that, and this is one of the main tenets of Angela's and John's book that we first published, John, that, we have to interpret sustainability as long-term viability for organizations. And I think the previous part of my presentation was really talking about that. If an organization needs to be viable in the long term, they have to really understand sustainability and what is going on in their wider context. I will talk a bit more about that later. So one of the works that we did here was to take three of the most prominent tools of sustainability, and we actually chose ones that are standards or issued by the International Organization for Standardization, that's ISO. And we chose three standards: the ISO 26000, which is basically guidelines on how to manage an organization towards sustainability. And then the next two are a bit more technical. The 14,001 is about how to specifically manage environmental aspects in your organization. And the last one is how to conduct, it's a very specific tool, how to conduct so-called life cycle assessments. So very different tools, but connected. And we argue that the connecting piece may be VSM. So understanding how an organization works and mapping these tools together, maybe we can actually improve their implementation, improve their integration. So how did we do this? First of all, we try to understand the relationships between the systems, the VSM systems, and the different clauses inside each standard. And then we actually map those. So I'm going to present to you like three different maps of how the standard and the different clauses of the standard map onto the various systems of VSM. And also, we did an analysis, like a very kind of a qualitative analysis that is inspired by diagnosing the system of, how does variety flow inside an organization when it's actually implementing or tries to implement each of these standards. So let me start, and before I start is, we use like an organizational scenario. So we said, let's have a manufacturing company, Widget Co, and like a pretty standard company with, all the kind of standard like functions here of marketing, general policy in system 5, procurement, and all of that. So we mapped out a generic kind of organization, and then we said, let's use that to now map the individual tools. So how would it look like when Widget Co tried to apply each one of these standards? So if we start with the 26,000, this was published in 2010. It's a massive standard because it's basically guidelines on how to implement sustainability at the organizational level. And I just want to show you here that this is the simplified diagram that is trying to help readers understand what's going on in the standard. It's overly complex. It's all over the place. It's so many things going on. So I would just show maybe two components that I think are like the most important ones from the standard. One of them is the so-called social responsibility principles. So basically the standard says that, there are 7 principles that any organization that wants to be sustainable or socially responsible has to respect: accountability, transparency, ethical behavior, respect for stakeholder interests, respect for the rule of law, international norms of behavior, and human rights. So irrespective of what an organization does, they have to respect at all times these principles. The other component of the standard is the so-called core subjects. Now, the core subject is a bit more of a pick and choose situation. So an organization should understand, and this is like general categories. They're broken down into more specific issues. An organization should understand, what is our impact, for example, in terms of fair operating practices? Do we relate with any of these issues? And if so, how? And an organization might decide that basically we only impact certain aspects of fair operating practices or human rights, or maybe human rights is not just such a big issue in our organization, but for another organization, human rights might be a huge issue. So the standard says that an organization should really understand their impact in their context and focus on the ones that are important from these core subjects. Now, if we look at the mapping, what we did here, you can see, I'm going to zoom in just a bit here. We mapped out all of the different clauses of the standard and tried to identify, with which VSM function we could relate them, best. So you see here, for example, principles of social responsibility, which I also have them here on the right. are probably like a system 5 kind of component. So at the system 5, at the normative level, an organization should understand these principles and make sure that are always applied throughout the organization. Other things like, the core subjects, they relate to different parts of the environment mostly, the context of the organization, but there are other things like, for example, environmental issues that you can trace even into the inside operations of the organization. For example, how you manage your operations and your electricity consumption which is something, let's say, internal, can have an impact on the environment, which is external. So we're trying to make sense of, of this massive standard and how can we use VSM to actually make sense of it. Another component of that, and of this analysis that I want to show here, is that we also kind of looked at the extended environment of the operational environments. So we not only looked at, let's say, the tier 1 suppliers or the immediate customers, we went a bit further to tier 2 and maybe even more upstream suppliers, and in some cases, downstream to consumers, and even at the end of life of a product or service. That will become handy later on when we talk about the life cycle assessment standard. So this is like the mapping of the different clauses, and then we looked at what does it mean from a variety perspective. And as you can see here, there's kind of a massive impact of data that has to be collected and interpreted from a system 3 perspective. So if an organization really takes ISO 26000 to heart, and actually deal with all the core subjects and the principles and all of that, there's going to be a lot of variety flowing and demand for data from operations. So there's a lot of back and forth between system 3 and system 1, but also between system 4 and its environment. And just to give you an example of that relationship, one of the fundamental practices of ISO 26000 is stakeholder identification and engagement. And I have some external stakeholders here. So basically, when we say stakeholders, traditionally, we think, the traditional stakeholders were like shareholders, competitors and customers. But the modern idea of stakeholders is much more than that, especially since some big corporations are keen to expand their purpose from shareholder value, which has been like the dominant paradigm for the last at least 40 years, to maximizing stakeholder well-being. Whether or not they're like genuine in that, intention, that's a different discussion. But there's been a legitimization of the many more stakeholders affecting an organization. So basically, ISO 26000 tells you that, as an organization, you have to, first of all, understand the immediate context, that's the stakeholders, identify who they are, understand their needs, engage with them, and then go even further. And in this case, I'm using the SDGs framework to understand the wider socioeconomic and socio-environmental aspects of your business. And that, in a nutshell, is the ISO 26000. The general remark is that it's like a massive standard. It's a very ambitious challenge for an organization to take on. When we go to the other two standards, things are a bit more simple because, we don't have, they have a more narrow scope. So in this case, the ISO 14001 is an environmental management standard, and it's based on the Plan, Do, Check, Act Deming cycle, and is how an organization can set up an environmental policy, implementation and planning processes to continuously improve its environmental performance. So again, some of the clauses of the standards here and how we map them. Similar aspects here with the ISO 26000. And if you look at the variety, it's much less variety, because in this case, you only have to deal with environmental data and much fewer stakeholders that you would have with the ISO 26000. And finally, the 14044 is a very, very specific tool in sustainability. It's based on trying to calculate. Oops, sorry about that. It's trying to calculate the impacts of a product or service throughout its life cycle. So we start from even the part when you extract resources from the environment up to the point where you actually throw that product or its packaging into the environment. What happens in all of these stages? So it's a very complex ordeal, and you take all the steps in this chain, and you have, for example, to gather the data, make the calculations, and, for example, calculate the global warming potential, the greenhouse gases, or the carbon footprint of a product. So how does that look like from an organizational perspective? First of all, some examples of how a life cycle assessment result can look like. In this case, we have a breakdown of a wine product and how the carbon footprint, which processes in a carbon footprint in a wine product's life cycle contribute to its carbon footprint. So, for example, you have the bottle production, which was kind of a surprise, having like almost a quarter of the impacts over the whole life cycle of the wine, right? Just the bottle. So life cycle assessment is a tool that can actually help you answer these kind of questions. Where should I put my attention? Try to find a lighter bottle, for example, or a different bottle, and that will help you with the majority of your impacts. So fewer things here from an organizational perspective, but from a variety mapping perspective, we see here that, again, we need a lot of data coming in either internally from the systems one. So an organization that wants to undertake a life cycle assessment has to have in place data collection mechanisms, or, and this is what's happening here on the environment, access to some public data sources that have pre-calculated data for suppliers. So, for example, you want to calculate the impacts of this bottle of this glass of water, and you may not know exactly how your suppliers are producing glass, but you can rely on this kind of public data sources. There is a lot of variety that's happening there, variety flow that is happening in the environment in that report, in that sense. So out of this analysis, we kind of came up with, so if we sum this all together, what would be like the generic sustainability functions inside an organization? And we identified this here. So, for example, in the system 5, you have to align the purpose of the organization and make sure it's actually explicitly talking about sustainability, creating a social responsibility culture or sustainability culture within the organization. And this is something that has to start from the top, from the system 5, the normative level. And then system 4 really has a lot of work to do, especially for organizations that are new in managing sustainability. They have to do a lot of stakeholder engagement, develop the model of what sustainability looks like in the environment and internally. And then there's the whole implementation piece that comes in, system 3 and below. So how do you implement the policies? How do you implement specific projects and programs to improve performance? So this is the main, let's say, generic functions that we came up with. And then what we really did is we looked at all the 3 standards. And so, how do they compare now if we take these generic functions? And the results are that, of course, the first one, ISO 26000, has a very wide scope. It requires a considerable, it poses a considerable variety load on the organization, and it's more emphasizing the strategic and normative levels of 4 and 5. So it's trying to help an organization really establish these 2 higher level systems before it can actually start implementing. ISO 40001, in contrast, is a bit more focused on the implementation part. Measurement and control. How do you measure environmental aspects? How do you report on the data and all of that? So it's a more of an internal load on the organization. And then 40044, it's really about how do you calculate performance indicators. And you could think that this is like a kind of a system 3 indicator, a KPI that system 3 can use for its operations to make decisions about how do we design and how do we build our products and services. In all three systems, in all three standards, we couldn't find something that we can, identify with system 2. There wasn't much emphasis on a coordination mechanism that, says, the different aspects need to be managed in such a way, and this has to happen in a coordinated fashion. We couldn't find explicitly a system 2 between these three standards. And finally, from that work, what we proposed is that the more an organization is opening up really the variety in the environment and the variety of their ambition in terms of sustainability, it's like they're adding layers of VSM. So for example, you can think about, you have like the classic business management layer of VSM. And then if they decide to include like a environmental management component or environmental management policy, that requires another set of VSM-like functions across the organization. That's like another layer. And if they include social components, that's another layer. So the more variety or the more components or aspects an organization is wanting to improve on, the more complexity it will face. So the challenge here is, on one hand, how can you see, and most standards are written in this way, they're only looking at one layer of management, right? And you can map that. But the challenge is, how do you now take all of these layers and manage them at the same time? So this is what we call the integration axis, like taking all of these different layers of social, economic, and environmental aspects and manage them as one. Any questions so far? Anyone's at least? Okay, and the final piece of work that I have been working on with some colleagues here in Canada is about how do you design our organizations, because so far we're talking about how do you manage organizations from a sustainability perspective. So you have an existing organization that the scenario goes, you have an existing organization that now needs to, it's somehow awakened by the fact that, there's a whole new context out there that is dynamic and challenging. How can we adapt now to this new environment? So it's kind of like an adaptation mechanism. But what if you're a startup and you're just now starting your business and you really want to be 21st century, future fit, viable, sustainable? You put the adjective there. If you look at, the previous best practice of creating a viable enterprise, and the viable here is not in the way that, the VSM community understands it, is, usually you have an idea, you write a business plan, you get the money, hard work, hope, luck, but this is not very efficient, effective, and reliable. And basically, studies show that, a lot of companies, in 2001, 60% of the firms in the manufacturing and service sectors were basically out of existence in about 6 to 7 years. So, there's a lot of talk about starting up, but how many of those companies do they really survive? And basically what is happening here is like you're burning a lot of cash. So the practice of designing new organization has improved and quite a bit in the last, let's say, 20 or so years, in the sense that there's now some business design tools, and especially the business model canvas, that has been used widely around the world in, incubators and accelerators. And this canvas really describes how an organization can create, deliver, and capture value. And this is like a kind of an official definition. And what is implied here is, when we're talking about value, we're implying financial value. So this is the business model canvas. It has 9 questions. Users can really brainstorm around the canvas and identify the customers and the resources and the partners and the revenues and the costs and all of that. And it has helped quite a lot, improve the practice of creating new businesses. There's been like the book of business model generation. There's been apps around this thing. So it's been very, very popular. However, we argue, given what I presented in the first part of the presentation, that this is dated nowadays and possibly dangerous, because you're setting up a startup to only focus on the strict financial aspects of the business, right? There's no consideration about the wider socio-environmental and other economic aspects that I talked about. So how do you do that from the start? And one of the models that we have been using here is the Flourishing Business Canvas. So the Flourishing Business Canvas has expanded the classic business model canvas. The idea of how you design is pretty much the same, but there are some important distinctions. So for example, you can see we have like the nested systems already here: economy, society, and the environment. We have things like biophysical stocks, the needs of stakeholders present there. Goals is here, which was completely absent from the business model canvas. So there's no space for an organization to really explicitly think about the goals of the startup. It's assumed that it's about profit maximization. But with this canvas, you can actually really model that here. So in the last few minutes, I want to present how this canvas, which has quite a lot of traction, and it's very useful for a lot of startups and others really, how can it be enhanced through VSM? And this is what I really am interested in. How can we use VSM together with other tools for the benefit of both? And I see that, when VSM is used with all these other methodologies, I know, some of you have written a lot of papers and books about, combinations. So when it is combined with other methodologies, the power is amazing. And it has like some emergent benefits when you combine it with other tools. In this case, I want to briefly show you an application of how in a project we used both the Flourishing Business Canvas and the VSM. So basically, we were approached by an agro-bio cluster. This is a spin-off of an established company in Greece, one of the first B Corp certified companies, B Corp being one of the major sustainability certifications. So the purpose alignment was there, very well established in the cosmetics industry, and they wanted to do another subsidiary or spin-off focusing on food. But they had the idea that we don't want to create a traditional company. We want to make it like a cluster. We want to invite like stakeholders like beekeepers and farmers and academia and industry, and we will be playing like a central role or coordinating all that for the mutual benefit of everybody. And that sounded very exciting. So we said, okay, we will help you design and develop this future business model. And since the owner knew about VSM, which I found like quite surprising, he said, okay, can you also use VSM and see, how that can help in this process? And we said, okay, sure. We will explore how VSM can help in the governance aspect of this new business model. So we set off, so we basically used both of these tools. It's like looking at the same organization through two different lenses, if you like. So first of all, we're, confronted with these various, graphs and diagrams, and, it was basically a data dump. They just gave us all this aspirational data about how they wanted their startup to look like. So we're trying to map it out. So this is a first attempt to map all of these aspects onto the canvas, right? And it's very convoluted. There's a lot of things going on there. So then we kind of switched to the VSM and said, okay, it seems like they want to create three different systems one: a research, education, and production component. And the cluster, the system in focus really is the cluster, this level 0. And within it, it has like research, education, and production. They weren't really clear about that before. They were like all of this together, and somehow this is gonna work, fine. So by switching to this recursion analysis or hierarchy analysis, we're able to clearly differentiate between these three different systems one. And maybe the even higher system is the agro-bio market segment. Having done that, then we let them know that, this was like a proposal from our side, and, the implications of this, segmentation can be immense. As you know, if you don't break your organization down into, proper or, appropriate systems one, it really doesn't matter what you do like later on with system 2 and system 3. This is like a basic intervention in the design of the organizations, and we let them know about that. And then we switch back to the business modeling, and now we use those three systems one, and we color coded the canvas to clearly show what parts of the business model relate to the production cluster, which is in red, to the research part, which is in green, and the education part, which is in blue. And everything kind of yellow is common to all of the three clusters. And after we did that, and these are like some examples of what is happening there in the canvas, we told them that they can use the canvas, and this is one of the ways that you can actually use the canvas to tell a story. So if you're pitching it to an investor, or if you're pitching it to a potential member for the cluster that wants to join, you can use the canvas to tell your story. So these canvases are often used for storytelling purposes. And then we switched back to VSM, and we said, this is, the analysis more or less, and just some parts of that, we went deeply into seeing, what's happening now there at the production level, the production part of the cluster. What stakeholders are they communicating with? What are the impacts? What is happening internally? Who is going to manage that part of the cluster? You're going to have some marketing and sales specifically for that part of the cluster. There's going to have to be some impact measurement and reporting. And this is things that they said they wanted, but now we're able to place them in the appropriate part of the organization. And of course, we really mentioned this, the squiggly lines, how these three systems one communicate and interact with each other, and that they have to be designed, and we have to really explore at a later stage how we can better manage this kind of relationships, and so on and so forth. So basically, then we try to identify all the different things that they needed and that they either said or implied, and we mapped them out onto the system, onto the VSM structure. And this is more or less the idea. So one of the basic things here that happened, and I want to stay on the system 5, they hadn't really a clear idea of how they wanted this new entity to function. And this is something that came up with the VSM analysis. So they said, we want a cluster, and our company is going to be centrally placed. And we challenged them with that and said, how's that going to work? Are you going to have like a cooperative style of managing this thing? Do you want to have like a considerable amount of decision-making power? How's that looking like? And we clearly identified that in System 5 and had that discussion with them. And after the project was finished, and having exposed them to the analysis of both the Canvas and the VSM, they realized that there's no way they needed like a co-op here. They were pretty clear that they wanted to have this thing operated like as their own company, right? So and I think part of how they came up to that conclusion was that they saw the variety of this and the immensity of this ambition of this endeavor, right? And said like, this is too much, and we clearly need to break it down and stage it, and we want we want this to be like internally managed first before we can open it up and the decision making to other parties as well. So some of the project wins, we know, use the hierarchical structuring or recursive structuring to organize the cluster and the business model in 3 main areas. So we used VSM to look at the business model and then come back again. We were able to cut through the complexity with this large amount of data. We're able to organize and map all of that inside both of the tools. And really, with the Canvas and VSM, and I think this is my final comment for the presentation, is that we were giving them a language to talk about the organization. And I think this last part of my presentation is about, when you're fluent in 2 different languages, you can have so much more interpretive and designing power. So you can switch from the business model, like the Canvas, and have that discussion there and talk about the business with that language. And then you can switch back to VSM and look at the governance perspectives. And actually, some of the work in progress that I'm doing right now is trying to explicitly map these 2 tools. So when you're looking at the Canvas, what aspects of the VSM are you playing with? So for example, when you're looking at value here, there's a box about value co-creations. You're kind of playing with system 3, system 1, and parts of the environment and stakeholders. And on the opposite side, if you go to a VSM, when you're playing with system 5, you're probably also dealing with goals here, right? So I'm trying to make this connection and mapping between these 2 tools. Having said that, the Canvas was really kind of expecting, and this is the design of my colleague Anthony Upward, VSM. There's a whole box here called governance, which is completely missing from the classic business model Canvas. So you could just say that, the whole meta system or the whole VSM analysis fits into that governance box. But I think it's more nuanced than that. There's like a many-to-many relationship between the 2 models. So that's all from me. As a final comment, I think that sustainability is the new normal. It's posing a huge variety load on organizations, and we need as many tools as we need tools that can actually express that complexity and help organizations improve. And this is demanding, of course, because the tools that we have already are not enough. And we already know that in the VSM community. We have been saying that, organizations are more complex than what we normally think. But I think now this is going at a whole other level with sustainability. And I strongly believe that VSM, together with other tools, can have amazing results. That's all for me. So I'm open to questions. I see that there are some questions in the chat, but I didn't have the chance to look at it.
Okay, can you stop sharing the screen, Panos, so we can see everybody in? Okay. Who'd like to start? Who's got the first question? Javier. Oh.
Yes. Thank you. Panos, I had an advantage over some of my fellow listeners because I was aware of part of the work you had been doing. So I did some work on my own following your subject. And maybe that's why I can say some things that others perhaps will not say immediately. I still have to go over your presentation like two or three times again to grasp the full scope of what you're saying. But I have a very important comment. When you present the model to your students about society and economy, I tend to get a little angry because I've been trying to show my fellow cyberneticians that society is too big a concept to handle, and that we are really talking about is organized society, which is the nation state, And then Stafford and I proved that the nation state is the economy. Okay, so there is no difference between the society, organized society, and the economy. It's the same thing. It's the same animal. It's just that because of the disciplines and the way it's being taught, we have political science on one side, we have the law in another side, and we have economics on the other side. But when you put it all together, you get the viable system, because the viable system has the decision-making, the lawmaking, and it has the economy exchanges of goods and services, okay? So one of the first things that I would like for us to do, following your own advice, that we have the wrong model in our heads, okay? And we don't have to perpetuate this mistake. We have to start talking about how we, the cyberneticians, are part of the subsystem of society, and its planning and its lawmaking and its decision making. Because if we don't involve ourselves in the political and the lawmaking, we are going to be like a brain in a jar. Okay, we can do all these presentations and we're not ever going to influence anything that goes on in society. Okay, I am, and Stafford was also very sick of we like doing nothing. Okay, so he wanted to intervene, to do something. That's why he went to Chile. That's why he came to Mexico, lost about a year here, trying to do something. So I would like the group to make this question. How can we, taking advantage of what you are saying, which is very, very deep and very profound, and you studied this, how can we make a difference in the way the planet and the nation states are being managed or governed, okay? Because if we don't do that, we've been too long just talking about this, and we're not getting into the practical aspects of doing something. I don't know how many of you have been involved in changing the law, in talking to your representatives or members of parliament about when are we going to start using all this stuff that we know, okay, so that we can make a difference, okay? So it's a question, but it's also a comment. And thank you for your patience.
No worries. Can I have a comment on your comment, which is kind of like a disclaimer, okay? And sometimes I get that from students. Do you believe that, we can change the world by, having companies like go after the new opportunities and, the carrots and the sticks and all of that, right? Using business as a force of good. And, there are some, big corps are saying that that is possible, right? And I tend to agree with you. I don't think that, by expecting businesses to do something for their own interest, even though that means they're going to be more sustainable, in quotes, that's going to help that's going to change the situation. So I have to somehow define my system in focus, and my system in focus is the organizational level. And I acknowledge that, the viability of that or / sustainability of that is really dependent on the nation state, on societal values, on the environment as a whole, and all that. So what I'm telling, my students and others is that, I'm talking about what can happen at the organizational level. And, there is stuff that can be done, right? There's a business case, for example, there's stuff that, it's like stupid that you haven't been doing already, strictly from a business point of view, right? But there's a limit to that. There's a limit to that. After a certain point, there has to be intervention from higher levels of hierarchy, of recursion, right? Yes. Personally, I don't deal with those levels, but I do recognize the impact and the interrelationships among levels, and these are important. So I'm not giving them I'm trying to, generally speaking, even though I'm talking about corporate and organizational sustainability, in no case am I saying, and if all of the organizations are applying these things, problem solved. No, by a long shot, right? That's my comment there. Thank you for that.
Yes. Yes.
Hugh,
Thank you very much.
Sorry, did you want to come back on that, Javier, before Hugh answers his question?
Yeah. Well, one little point is when you deal with the organizations, there's a line coming through the authority of the organization in the vertical channel coming directly from the state, from the laws. Okay. And these set up the environment where the business operates. Okay. Unfortunately, this is the way things work. When the law sets just the minimum ethical requirements for organizations, and the law is not being more explicit, then it is unprofitable to give the public more than the law demands. Okay, and then you get into a prisoner's dilemma type of game there, because if you try to give more for the money you're earning, then others will become more profitable, and you are going to die.
But this goes at the heart of the argument. Sorry to interrupt. Whether that's like the kind of dry logic, right? What I presented before is that that is kind of short-sighted. A lot of organizations still keep working like that, but they're missing out to some larger value later on, right? And if you always go for the minimum, a pandemic hits, for example, and people that have shown responsibility and accountability and initiative and all of that may be rewarded by the consumers or the customers or communities and stakeholders in the longer term, because they can be like brand loyalty. And I'm not saying it's the solution to everything, but the business case for all of that is pretty compelling. Let me put it this way. And it's beyond the minimum legal requirement. Should we go with Hugh or no?
Yeah, Hugh, and then Wolfgang.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll try and frame this simply. The recurring question that I was thinking about was, is simplification a productive way to go here? So are there things to gain by making rules and trying to write simple standards? Or is this more about having people care and really getting into the nuance of the situation?
I think, yeah, I will use the scenario that we use in the paper for how do we think an organization should change using VSM language. You may recall that there was a lot of interaction between System 4 and the environment. So it has to understand, talk to stakeholders, understand what's going on, 17 SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, and this and that, what's going on. That's a lot of variety to take in. But for System 4 to have that permission to go there or to seek the resources to go there, it has to have approval, right? So at the normative level, the System 5 has to allow for these things to happen and has to have intention to do that. So I think what you're pointing towards, you, and maybe I'm wrong, is that unless there is like a very simple, just intention to do whatever we can because we care, right, kind of thing, then it doesn't matter, because you can do all this analysis, and we have seen it as a consultant. I have seen all the time. We're gonna do the life cycle assessment, and this is the result and the KPI, and here are some policies and procedures. Thank you to this self. Nobody cares, because the System 5 is not really paying attention, so it's deemed as irrelevant, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's why we said there has to be alignment of purpose at the System 5 level and creation of the culture that is what propagates from 5 to everybody else. That's the I forget the VSM term for that. The corporate ethos, right? So unless that variety opens up first, it doesn't matter what happens lower. I mean, you maybe not. And that's the other thing. We also showed that in some cases we have system 2, or what we describe as system 2, like employee-led initiatives that care about this stuff, even though system 5 doesn't care. And they can be like a bottom-up emergence, and they can affect policy, that they can come down and say, okay, now we see it's important. Now we're making this as a policy. Now we're gonna like do this in a more coherent and organized manner. This can happen too.
I'm just thinking of examples, and the huge one was Volkswagen. I mean, yeah. I mean, for me, I've had experience in programming, and if any kind of career that you're involved in, if you're doing it, if it's there's a professionalism to what you're doing, which means you're going beyond. What I would consider as a professional is your interests are beyond those of the organization you work for in terms of your discipline and the skills that you bring to what you do. Yes. And so if you're not able to execute upon a certain set of ethics, then then that in itself is, I think, an example that goes, that's like a system 5 suppressing that outcome.
And I think that's the case of actually looking at a person being part of multiple recursive hierarchies. Like, you have a role in the organization, but that's not your only role, right? You have like
yeah. But just to keep things simple, I mean, we had a presentation not so long ago of, I can't remember the chap's name, but on wiggly lines, and basically saying, the last mile, and about how do you empower workers to go beyond their basic remit. And it will be interesting to look at that in terms of something like Volkswagen. I mean, I think Martin Pfeiffer had a big involvement with them, so I don't know. That would be very interesting to look at. But I was wondering also, in terms of things that we can do, even just in the terms of use of words, this sort of thing could become more up in the public domain, of actually, writing interesting articles or what have you, just saying, looking into these sorts of things, right? Just like, the systems view of certain organizations,
Right. So an analysis of Volkswagen from a systems view, what failed and what
happened.
or
just, but more contemporary, looking around saying, not going beyond just gloss and PR and sort of, because, you look at companies now who say, give the impression they're producing extremely clean cars, when of course they're completely disconsidering the pollution that's gone into the actual production of the car itself, and then lots of details about pollution that aren't on the agenda, just like, what happens when the tire hits the road and all the particles that are as pollution there. So but yeah, just getting that into the public domain by people that care to help. I think the avenue is about caring, not so much, caring first and getting the legislation changed subsequently. Although, there is a big hurdle. In my lifetime when I was an adult, there's only a few things I've been surprised at that have happened through just top-down decisions, like stopping public smoking, and issues around when there were reduced amounts of petrol available, and just a complete change in behavior by people. So yeah, and of course you've got the COVID stuff now, but those are top-down stuff. So yeah.
Okay, Wolfgang, your turn, and then John Lee's got a question.
I have a question or comment. May I? Okay.
Yeah.
Should we hear from Wolfgang first?
Wolfgang and then John Lee. We got a queue here.
You're muted, Wolfgang. You're muted.
Yeah, well,
Right, thank you. So great, thank you for your presentation. It was really great. Because I mean, coming back, returning to Javier's question, what can we do? I mean, we are a small group. We are not. We don't hold the powers in our hands. But I think a small way is to show that actually the VSM, the model itself, is something that really helps to explain whether it is embodied in whatever surrounds you. And what you did, your analysis of the ISO standards, is in a way to show that the VSM is a very useful tool that's used everywhere. And I think one way is to make people, by these empiric examples and analysis, make them aware that the VSM is not just a fantasy model, but it's real everywhere around. But whatever you analyze, you find it. And in that regard, also I like very much your your extension of the canvas model, which I also think is a bit reductionist. My question relates, I mean, what you did, as far as I understood it, is you tried to map certain aspects of sustainability to the systems functions. My question is whether this, which is important, but in order to become a sustainable organization, or an organization that is promoting sustainability, whether the mapping to systems functions is sufficient, or whether we shouldn't also look at the interrelations between the system functions. And because you can have a system 5 values and principles there, but if your communication and power channels to all other functions, and I think that's my question, whether we in the VSM community, we should also focus also in the future a bit more on the interrelations, on the channels, not only on the systems functions. Yeah, but I'd like to turn to you.
This is a very good point, and I think I'm not sure if we actually explicitly, and John, I can remember the paper now, we explicitly addressed that, but what we, I guess, maybe intuitively did was that we used a scenario. So every time, and that paper was published, one of the papers was published in the Journal of Cleaner Production, which is like a very mainstream sustainability journal, right? I don't think there was any other VSM paper there. So we weren't talking to cyberneticians and our community. It was like to the wider sustainability community, right? And it was kind of a paper to do this analysis on ISO, but really to say, hey guys, this is an amazing tool, right? And here's a little kind of lecture on why it is and how it can be relevant for sustainability. And the way we did it is, of course, the mapping and all of that, but also we had a scenario of how this plays out. So we use storytelling to do these connections. So what I said before, the CEO goes at a conference and whatever, and they see this thing like, they are exposed to the sustainability. Oh my God, so we pay attention to that. Let's give it to somebody at System 4 to explore that. So it's the chance of System 4 to open up. It has the permission to open up the variety and take from the environment, like, standards and this and tools and, okay, so this is happening out there. What do we do now? And there's a discussion. So we kind of use storytelling as the medium to make this, to show these connections, as well as the mapping, the video.
I liked it very much because it makes the VSM more dynamic.
Exactly.
The problem I see currently in the way we talk about it, it's very static.
Yes.
But it's a highly dynamic system, and I think, in my perception at least, I think I like your approach. We should emphasize that more.
I strongly believe we can borrow from other disciplines, especially the design thinking. Recent years, and how they're using storytelling. Around the canvas, of course, but it doesn't matter. Storytelling is what is important here, right? And for example, I really like, and I like the idea that I think maybe Hugh proposed about Volkswagen, and it's one of the classic examples I give to my students about sustainability. And am I analyzing this way and that way? What if we said, let's look at how the Volkswagen scandal played out using VSM language, right? And if you look at it as a language, I think it's a bit more dynamic, because I agree, the diagrams I showed you from the mapping seems like, you're taking parts of the standard and you put it in buckets, right? It's like yes, it's there, but it's more than that. And, maybe if I did it now, I would do it like in a different way, but storytelling would definitely be a part of it or something similar.
Okay, John Lee, you got a question, and then Ceslo.
Okay, so Wolfgang and Hugh were at a level of detail of recursion. I want to go back up to a higher level where Javier was. I was introduced to Platform for Change in 1976. In 1980, to the Society of General Systems Research, I said in San Francisco, we have to do the environment first, the society second, and the economy third. We cannot do the economy first. That's the way the California Environmental Quality Act defines planning in California. I have been working, Javier, at the political level, at the city level for the last 25 years to try and impose VSM thinking about city planning, about housing, transportation. For the last 2 years, I've been working with the League of Women Voters on doing it with healthcare. So as far as I'm concerned, the analysis was exquisite. I know enough about ISOs that the difference between the three is incredible. And with the three, you can do a 3-layer recursion that it can analyze all of those things. It was an elegant analysis, and I thank you. I don't have a question. I'm just full of it.
Okay.
I love to talk about VSM. So I take 2 minutes and then, thanks for your time, and your work is exquisite. I'm going to rewatch your talk.
Thank you.
Ceslo, you had a question.
Go ahead.
Okay, I have 2 points. It seems to me that the VSM has one characteristic, namely the precision of the language. That at each level, at each system, a certain level of language precision is needed. And what I have many problems, for instance, with studying the so-called complexity. So my first question would be, how do you understand complexity out of this whole mess, understanding of complexity? So this is my first point. My second point, more precise, is because it seems to me that the VSM has inbuilt attempts to keep the precision of the language at each levels separate, because otherwise, if you seek for causal links between the terms which have such a broad meaning as, for instance, peace, health, stability of the world, and then you try to figure out the causal links, that there may be problems. So once again, how do you understand complexity? And what about the precision of the terms used in your narratives at specific levels of the VSM? Do you care about this? What were your reflections? Thank you.
So that's a good point. Since I talked about language, how are you using the language? It's a very important point. So the first thing about complexity, we try to use a cybernetic term or variety. So throughout our paper and our work, we're talking about, how much variety is, for example, a system needing to process to make sense of sustainability, or how much variety is being transmitted through a channel, right? Do you have the capacity to transmit all that variety? And basically, I think one of the things that we're saying is that, it's one thing to talk about, hey, let's be sustainable now and we care. Have you thought about the governance or management implications of that? If you truly care, have you thought about how much data, which is variety, right? You need to monitor and manage and communicate and translate. And of course, there's so many papers you can write about, how do you then go into the translation, the transduction of this environmental and other sustainability data into, in other systems. How do we understand about these things? And one of the points that you're making there about, how do you, how precise you are. What we did in at least the storytelling example is, again, because we're trying to be a bit more, friendly, audience friendly here, right? And the thing with VSM, when you're trying to introduce a new field that is not like already, in cybernetics, and we know what VSM is and this and that. you have to sacrifice, in lack of a better word, like a part of your paper to explain VSM first before we can actually go into, describe how we applied it. So we tackled that by first saying the theory part, or our analysis part in VSM language, and then switching into everyday language until VSM becomes everyday. We have to do that. So we're saying like, and System 5 communicates with System 4 to do this, and balance it with System 3. And then in the story we say, Jackie talked to Ben about that, and they communicated for this. So it's the same idea expressed in a different language. And I find that even from a consulting point of view, or even an academic point of view, you have to make these translations. And at the end of the day, I'm all for academic rigor and scientific rigor, right? What do we mean with a term? It has to be very specific. But we are facing such a huge challenge in front of us that I've reached a point that I don't care about names. Call it whatever you want. If the system and the idea is there, that's fine with me. And we have this issue with sustainability all the time. My colleagues, for example, they're saying, no, sustainability is not the term now, it's flourishing, right? Sustainability is not enough. It's talking about minimizing harm and not enough about, maximizing good. It's about regenerative economies and flourishing and all that. I say, it's a matter of definitions. You want to call it flourishing? Fine. You want to call it sustainability? Fine. You want to call it like something else? I don't care. As long as you use that, and this is why I prefer models, systemic models, and do something with it. So on one hand, yes, I think if you're precise with your use of the language and your modeling, for example, it's better variety management at the end, right? You're not creating confusion. But when you're going to the being an agent of change in the public, then you're gonna have to make concessions there and meet them where they are. That would be my comment.
Okay, any more questions? Okay, well, it's 6:25. We're 5 minutes early. If there's nothing else, I think we can thank Panagiotis for a inspiring talk and very fascinating questions. Oh, hello, we've got another hand up.
No, it's an applause. Oh, no, Javier.
Oh, it's a clap. Okay, great.
Actually, I think Javier wants to talk too.
Yeah, I wanna make one last comment because we still have time. I reflected a lot about the ISO standards and everything, and I studied this, what you had done before at length, okay? And I see the ISO standard in the same category as the complicated systems, okay? Mm-hmm. In the way that David Snowden understands them, okay? And what is very clear is that we can translate. I've done this, and I'm gonna share. I just noticed that I never did this in a presentation in YouTube, but I have all the stuff almost ready. So I'm gonna show all of you how we can use the viable system to map, for instance, the canvas into the VSM, and it fits perfectly as you have shown, okay? But also that these complicated systems are not gonna solve any problems, okay? We need the VSM and the thinking in cybernetic management terms to be able to solve complex problems of complex systems. Complicated systems have shown that they don't save any company from a fatal history, okay? I bet you that Kodak and Lehman Brothers and all of them had plenty of complicated systems working for them, and that didn't stop them from going bankrupt, okay? So that's one final commentary. And you've done tremendous work, and it's very valuable.
Thank you, Javier. I'm just going through some of the comments here in the chat. We have 3 minutes, John. Should I?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, I thought I covered most of them, but if there's something I missed, go ahead.
Okay, Maya had a question, but I guess I answered that. So Johnny, cradle to cradle, of course, it's part of the, it's more relating to the life cycle, thinking aspect, and but again, how do you? So again, my goal is how do you take an organization and actually do that? And it's not only up to the organization. No individual organization, unless they have like the size of an Amazon or something, right? They have like this immense power, can do these things by themselves. But maybe they can do something towards that direction. So this is the basic premise here. And they can, by network effects, that this becomes the new normal. Who knows, right? So yes, cradle to cradle, very basic book. GDP and GNP, yes, it's how we define, like this is really important. How do you define? And if you look at it from a VSM perspective, I mean, if you're only measuring the performance of a system in that way, it's of course you're going to maximize the system towards GDP, right? This is the only thing that but it's completely a partial view of the system, and distorted, hugely distorted. So yeah, that's another intervention point. How do you measure performance? How do you communicate that, and then how that affects decision? Because coming back to I think it was Hugh's comment, the normative, the intention might be there, but if you're not relying on, if your indicators are wrong, maybe you will still like hit the ship to the, to sink. Yeah, these are my comments. Thank you. I don't know if he's still, Marcus, is he still here for the paper? Like he said, it's a very similar paper, I guess, that he wrote about sustainability and organizations. That's it.
Okay, great. So thanks. I think this is inspiring work, and
Very
I
good.
can work on and develop it as time goes on. So thanks ever so much, Panagiotis, and hopefully see you all in 2 weeks for the next one. Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.